Thank you, everybody. We're super excited to welcome a next round of Juneteenth speakers today. What happens when a white woman, Phoebe, contacts a black woman, Betty, saying she suspects that they are connected through slavery? First, surprise. Betty responds, "Hello, cousin." Betty Kilby Baldwin entered and graduated from Warren County High School after suing based on the landmark decision, the Brown Supreme Court decision. Phoebe Kilby, a descendant of enslavers, was inspired by the Coming to the Table movement to connect with descendants of people her family enslaved. Cousins indeed, they commit to a path of reconciliation. Together, they wrote the book Cousins, which details each of their paths to finding each other, reconciling with the dark past, and looking towards a brighter future. In alternating chapters, each tells their dramatic story, from Betty's experience as one of the first black children to attend her desegregated school, to Phoebe's eventual question to Betty, "How do I begin to repair the harms?" Please give a warm Gilman welcome to Ms. Betty Kilby Baldwin and Ms. Phoebe Kilby.
I am Betty Kilby Baldwin, an ancestor of slaves. My ancestors were slaves.
And I am Phoebe Kilby, a descendant of persons who once enslaved Betty's family. And we have come to the table.
Phoebe and I were inspired to meet and to get to know each other by an organization and movement called Coming to the Table. The name Coming to the Table refers to Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, when he says, "I have a dream that the sons of former slaves and of former slave owners will be able to sit down at the table of brotherhood." And in our case, we like to say sisterhood. Our book, Cousins, is our Coming to the Table story.
When I first learned of Coming to the Table, I was intrigued, and I decided, I wonder if my family enslaved people. So I thought, well, maybe I should look into this, something I'd never thought of. Were my family enslavers? I wasn't sure. But I had, when I thought about it, I had inklings that perhaps they were. But my father and the family, they never talked about this. See, I grew up here in Baltimore. In fact, I went to Bryn Mawr. But my father had grown up in Virginia, and I knew the family had farms there in Virginia and had deep roots there. Well, I began the research skills I learned at Bryn Mawr and things that you're learning here today at Gilman, and quickly I could determine that my family had enslaved people. I found it in the U.S. Census. There was my great-great-grandfather, and he had enslaved 2 people. It was awful to read about that. But, I switched then to online research. I was looking at some original documents there, and I found Betty. See, Betty had written a book about her life entitled Wit, Will, and Walls. When I read it, I just knew our families were connected. For example, I could tell from this book that her father had grown up on a farm in Rappahannock County, Virginia, literally within a mile of where my father grew up. They had to have known each other. My father never said to me that there were black Kilbys that lived down the road from him. But I learned a lot more from this book than just that, Betty's first book. I learned that she and her family had been leaders in school desegregation in the 1950s. It's an overwhelming story of bravery and grit. And Betty's going to tell you more about that in a few minutes. But at this point, I didn't have proof that our families were connected. I knew my family had enslaved people. I knew my father had grown up near where her father grew up, but didn't have the proof. So I confided in one of the founders of that group we talked about, Coming to the Table. And he said, "Phoebe, if you want to find out the answer, you're going to have to contact Betty. Next week is Martin Luther King Day, and that would be a good day to do it." Whoa. I had just in the last month figured out that my family enslaved people, and you're saying I should contact her? But, the thought about it, and wow, that would be a symbolic day to do this. So I'm going to read to you the email I sent to Betty. Whoops. Oh, well, I'll find it here. On Martin Luther King Day, 2007. Here he is. So, the subject line is an invitation to conversation. Dear Betty, my name is Phoebe Kilby and I am white. My father grew up in Rappahannock County, Virginia, near where your father grew up. I have been doing some research on my family and have also read your book. Having no definitive answers, I suspect that our families had some kind of relationship in the past. I admire very much your courage and the courage of your father and family during the civil rights era and since. It would be an honor to talk to you and meet you someday. Maybe through conversation, we might both find out a little bit more about our family's past. Martin Luther King had a dream that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Perhaps we as daughters can contribute to fulfilling that dream. I hope to hear from you and to hear that you are interested in conversing with me. Phoebe Kilby. I hit send. A day went by. No response. Then 2 days. Then a week. Then almost 2 weeks. And I went back to my coming to the table friends and I said, she's not getting back to me. And I thought, why would she? Why would she want to talk to somebody like me? But let me tell you, those folks would not let me off the hook. They said, you need to send a longer email and tell more about yourself. So I did, and I'm not going to read all that, but I sent a longer email, and within an hour or so, I got a response from her. And the subject line of her email to me was, "Hello, cousin." Wow, I was truly touched. I didn't know if we were cousins, but I felt honored that she had opened her heart enough to me to call me cousin. So now I'm going to turn this over to Betty so she can tell you about how we met, her perspective on our meeting, and also tell you some of her amazing story.
Well, Phoebe suspected what I'd known practically all my life, that I was descended from slaves and probably had white relatives. Therefore, it was only natural for me to respond, "Hello, cousin." But here's the email that I sent to her. Phoebe, if you're asking yourself why I am so emotional, the Cultural Innovations email address gets full of spam mail and is often down. I went to the site this morning and emails began to download. It could only have been God. We are the key to healing. Meeting you today is so awesome. People will find it hard to believe. I can't believe it. I've always known that we were descendants of slaves, but I couldn't open that door. We can not only contribute to Dr. King's dream, we can bring about racial reconciliation and healing to a nation of hurting people. When I heard from Phoebe, I was going around the world selling my book and giving lectures to high school students on school desegregation. I don't know how much you know about Brown's decision that outlawed segregated schools, so let me give you the cliff notes. The details are in our book, Cousins, in Chapter 4, Soldiers Without Uniforms. The year was 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision that outlawed segregated schools. There were 5 cases. They came from the North in Virginia, from the South in South Carolina, from the East in Delaware, and from the West in Topeka, Kansas. And that's the one that most of you learn about in school. There was even a case in Washington, D.C. that was heard before the Supreme Court, and it was included in the Brown decision. The problem was a national problem that caused a lot of division amongst the races. When the white school in the county where I lived continued to be segregated, even after the Brown decision, our local NAACP decided to sue the school board. I was the named person in the suit, and it became Betty Ann Kilby versus the Warren County Board of Education. I was only 14 years old at the time. But in 1958, the governor of Virginia closed schools rather than to let little black children and little white children go to school together. Now, how do you think that made me feel? Well, that didn't stop us. We became a part of history. We continued to fight until we got to go to that school together. It was a brutal battle. Shots were fired at our house. The African American children couldn't participate in many of the school activities. I didn't even get to go to my own high school prom. We were called names, picked on, and abused. But we made it through because we had received some training in nonviolence practiced by Dr. Martin Luther King. Didn't work all the time. Sometimes we just couldn't get with the nonviolent movement. But it provided a good foundation for us to start. I finally graduated from high school in 1963. My grades weren't pretty, and I couldn't even get into college. In the fall of 1985, 22 years after I graduated high school, I took a Virginia history class. And on page 138 of Cousins, I write. I'm not as good as Phoebe with being able to get the book and read from it, so I will tell you what I wrote. When I sat in Dr. Hofstra's Virginia history class, I didn't want to study history because it meant talking about slavery. Yet, from Dr. Hofstra, I learned about the free black community developed in the midst of slavery. I had never heard that before. I learned that the first African Americans who came to America as indentured servants lived out their period of indentureship and helped to formulate the free Negro community. Dr. Hofstra even taught me that my case was an important part of history. But I didn't want to learn anything about my people's history because it hurt. And everything that I knew didn't do a thing to make me feel good about myself. I would rather have been ignorant of my history than become better informed because of the pain that was involved. Have you heard that before? However, Dr. Hofstra managed to get me to open my eyes to my ancestors and the great accomplishments that they had made despite the suffering and sacrifice.
So that first night when I met Betty, she had invited me to a family dinner, and she forgot to tell her family I was coming at first, and I don't think they were quite sure of me. They were very polite and nice, but they did ask me a few questions. They wondered if I was going to stick around, or was this just a one-time thing, and one even muttered, "Where's my 40 acres and a mule?" But they still would talk to me, and they still continued to talk to me. And so after we first met, Betty was living in Texas at the time. I was in Virginia there. So she went home, and I thought, well, how are we going to get to know each other? I want to get to know this family because they seem to be connected to me, and probably through slavery. So it became apparent to me very quickly that an important anniversary was coming up. And that's the 50th anniversary of Betty and her family, her brothers, integrating that high school, Warren County High School. Her brother was living near where I lived in Virginia, her brother James. And he had formed a group called the Historical Education Movement. And the purpose of it was to honor this history and his father. I thought, well, this is a way to get to know them. So I asked him, can I join your group? And he said, okay, yeah, you can join our group. So we had a group of community members that wanted to honor this history. And I want you to know that one of our members was a young woman who had just graduated from that high school that Betty and James had integrated. And when she found out that all this history had happened there, that the governor of Virginia had closed the school to keep it from being integrated, she was upset because nobody taught this history when she was in high school. An amazing event had happened at her own high school. No one had said a word about it. So just wanted to bring her up because she's a young person that joined our activist group. And the first thing we wanted to do was to get the school board to name that school after Betty and James's father, who had been instrumental in pushing for that court case. His name, and I want you to remember it, is James Wilson Kilby. So we went to school board meetings, and unlike some of the ones you're reading about today in the paper, we were very calm and very respectful and just expressed our opinion that we thought it was important to rename that school after their father, after Betty and James's father. And we wrote letters to the editor, and we called the school board members, but they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. There were other members of the community who were pushing in the other direction. But we decided that we wouldn't give up, that we wanted to bring this history to light. So we went to our friends at Coming to the Table and secured a small grant so that we could have a community dialogue. And the point I want to make here is sometimes you can push ahead, but if you haven't brought others along with you, you may be unsuccessful. So we decided if we had a community dialogue about how to honor this history, maybe we could do something here. And sure enough, that worked. What we did is we brought together people of the era when the school was desegregated. Betty and James and other African Americans who had been there at the time. White students who were there. Imagine, some of them were seniors in high school, and one day the teachers come in and say, "Pack up your books, school's closing." And they're going, "Wait a minute, I want to graduate here," and they were affected too. And we brought on a teacher from the time period, and also a school bus driver as well as regular members of the community. And we sat down for 6 months and had intense dialogues of 3 hours apiece, talking about how to bring this history to light and what we should do about that. And at the end, we were able to come together with an action plan of ideas of how to honor this history. And the first thing on the list was get this in the history curriculum. And the school board did agree to do that. But the next thing was we really wanted a historic marker in front of the school. And we were lucky right then, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources realized that their roadside marker program was presenting a lopsided version of history. I don't know what it's like in Maryland here now, but in Virginia at that time, which was around 2010, all the markers were about the homes of founding fathers or Civil War battlefield sites. So they were thinking we need to bring more of our Virginia history out, and they wanted this history told. So we were able to secure a marker, and I'm going to show you here a video of the dedication of the marker, which shows you how you can bring a community together to do something good along these lines.
Tonight we're getting a first-hand account of what it was like during one of the most tumultuous times in Warren County history. It has been more than 50 years since school desegregation, and the students impacted came back together tonight to recognize where they came from and just how far we have come. It's a story that's new tonight from TV3's Sarah Robarge.
The principal announced our school was going to close. So at first, it would seem like a small vacation.
June Jeffrey was a senior at Warren County High School back in 1958. She says when she found out these doors might stay closed for good, it was scary.
We were seniors, and we needed to know if we were going to graduate.
June's class is called the Lost Class of 59 because many of these seniors never graduated from here. And these doors remained closed until a historic day in February 1959, a day Reverend James Kilby will never forget.
At least 150, 200 protesters, and they were hollering and screaming and telling us to go home and calling us the N-word. 16 years old, you couldn't understand why adults would treat kids that way when you wanted to get your education.
Kilby was one of the Warren County 23, the first black students who integrated Warren County High School after a judge ruled it unconstitutional to keep them out. After unveiling this marker that commemorates their fight for equality, Kilby, Jeffrey, and other members of the Warren County 23 and the lost class of 59 walked together through the doors of their high school for the first time in 50 years.
It's a sign of unity, walking up the hill together, being together. We've come a great way. We still have ways to go, but I just believe that we can work together now. It has broken down some of the things that have stood in our way to be here today.
I rejoice today because I've been through the struggle, and now today was peaceful, a day where we could celebrate.
In Warren County, Sarah Robarge, TV3 News.
And an emotional moment for sure. The marker is set right outside of the former Warren County High School, which is now the middle school. You can see it as you drive along Luray Avenue.
So if you think about that, we brought a community together, Betty's family and me and others, in a form of reparations. You hear that term, and a lot of times we think of one thing about reparations, it being done at the federal level and being involved in just cash money given. But this is, I think, an example of a community reparations project, and something that could be even done here in Baltimore. Projects like that to repair the harms that have created divisions within the community with regard to race and perhaps other divisions. So it was great to be able to support this community effort, coming together and to honor Betty and her family's achievements. But at the time I started to think, am I doing enough? What should I do personally? How should I make amends for my families having participated in slavery, in Jim Crow, and everything since? And when I mean Jim Crow, I mean here in Baltimore, my father, a doctor, I remember him having separate waiting rooms for African Americans and European Americans when I was a little girl. So everything, not just the slavery, but everything up till now, including my own racism, which I absorbed as a child here in Baltimore, in segregated Baltimore. Because when I was growing up, Bryn Mawr only had white students until I was a sophomore, and Gilman only had white students for a long, long time. So I thought, what can I do? How can I make amends? Some personal reparations to Betty and her family. So I decided to ask Betty what she thought, and she said, Phoebe, you didn't enslave anyone. You don't need to do anything more than you're already doing. But I just couldn't let that go. I kept thinking, what is it? What could I do? And then it hit me. This family had sacrificed so much to get an education. Think about that. Having your house shot at, being abused at school every day. They had gone through hell to get an education. What if I set up a scholarship endowment, a scholarship fund that would benefit descendants of persons my family enslaved? And that would include Betty and her brother James, who you saw in the film, their grandchildren. So I took that idea back to them and said, what do you think? And that was something they could go for. Because, see, it wasn't for them. It was for their grandchildren. So in 2014, I established the Kilby Family Endowed Scholarship Fund, and 3 of Betty's grandchildren received scholarship to attend college this school year. So that is a form of personal reparations that people like me, I feel it's important for us to do. And this has inspired other members of our Coming to the Table group to also do personal acts of reparations, like setting up scholarship funds. So we're going to end with Betty.
Today, we stand boldly together as the Kilby family at the table of brotherhood, working to achieve another one of Dr. King's dreams, that of the beloved community. a society founded on justice, equality, reconciliation, and love for all. Thank you for listening to our story, which is outlined more in our book, Cousins. We are now ready to answer your questions.
Oh, come on, somebody has a question.
What's the most important thing that you got out of this presentation today? To you and to your future.
So you said maybe to sit down together and talk across the racial divide and talk about reconciliation. That's sort of a summary, but
Yeah.
anybody else have a thought or a question? So he's asking how we can help not just youth, but older people to reach across the racial divide. And actually, that is what the organization that we're involved in, Coming to the Table, tries to do. It tries to involve youth, of course, but I have to say it's mostly older people like us that are involved in this. And I would like to let you know that here, Coming to the Table is a national organization, but we have local groups, local chapters, and there's a local Baltimore chapter that Betty and I have spoken before. And if you go to the website, comingtothetable.org, you can look up the Baltimore chapter and contact them, and you could even join some of those old folks. I wouldn't say they're all old, but some of those folks, and give your youthful perspective on the problems of racism in this country and how we can reach across the racial divide and work together. Betty?
Yes, most of the people that we deal with are older people, and they can kind of relate to us. We relate to you through my grandchildren and listening to their perspective. And my grandson, who is the second year in college, he has gone on presentations and been a part of when I've done presentations on my first book, Whitwell and Walls. So it's not difficult because old people know what happened. Old people have the heart for what happened, and a lot of old people haven't forgotten.
And I just had another thought, too. Many of us in Coming to the Table, if you're going to join an organization like this, which is designed to bring together descendants of persons who were enslaved and descendants of persons who were enslavers, there's sort of a bent toward working on racial reconciliation, right? But our group, I had a group in Asheville, North Carolina, we decided that we were tired of talking to the people that think like us, and that we were going to take on a project of each of us trying to connect with somebody who would resist this idea, with the idea of, through maybe connecting with them in a respectful way, we might gradually change their minds. So that's something we can do as well in terms of working with older folks.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking today. Can we get another round of applause for our speakers?